Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So today is part 2 of our deep dive into the book The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel Van Der Kolk. So in part 1 we started exploring different features of trauma. So we're going to continue that in part 2. We start with bullet point number 6, which is not all people react to trauma in exactly the same way. So in order to illustrate this point, he tells the story of a husband and wife couple who were involved in a car accident, and they were both very traumatized because they were trapped in their car and they didn't know if somebody was going to come and rescue them. So what they did this experiment where somebody told them to go ahead and talk about the accident. So in other words, to trigger a flashback, and during their flashbacks, they had their brain imaged. And what was interesting was that the wife's brain basically looked blank on the image. It was like she went into what's called freeze mode. He also refers to this as depersonalization, where she's just completely disconnected from herself and she's not able to feel anything. Now, when they measured her heart rate and blood pressure, there was no increase in heart rate or increase in blood pressure. Everything was just numb. And that was her response to the trauma. And then in contrast to that, the husband's response was very activated. He was having active flashbacks. It increased his heart rate. He got really agitated. So this example shows that the story gets a little bit complicated because every person responds in their own unique ways. So now we move on to bullet point number 7, which is called 3 levels of safety. So essentially, he starts talking about Porges theory. The last name is Porges. This is a researcher who developed his own theory of the autonomic nervous system. I will make a separate video just about his book because he wrote a whole book about it. But for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to summarize what Bessel Van Der Kolk is talking about. Essentially, he's talking about Porges theory. So the basic premise of his theory is that you have these 3 levels of the autonomic nervous system. So he's saying whenever we feel threatened, we instinctively turn to the first level, which is social engagement. So that's when we call out for help, support, and comfort from the people around us. So that's the best case scenario. When you're being traumatized or you're in danger, you can ask for help and somebody comes and helps you or comforts you. Then if no one comes to our aid or we're in immediate danger, the organism reverts to a more primitive way to survive, fight or flight. So this is what we know as the activation of the sympathetic nervous system with the sweating and the dilated pupils and the fast heartbeat, right? And then the third one is if there's no way out and there's nothing we can do to stave off the inevitable, we will activate the ultimate emergency system, the dorsal vagal complex, DVC. So to me, that was an important concept to understand. Actually, that was groundbreaking because we always hear about the vagus nerve being the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and digest branch. And so what I learned when I read this book is that there's actually another branch of the parasympathetic nervous system called the dorsal vagal complex, as opposed to the anterior branch. And so the dorsal branch is completely separate because it puts you into freeze mode, and that is not healthy. That dorsal branch, when you read that other book I was mentioning, they talk about how that one is an older branch in terms of evolution. And symptoms of the freeze mode may include a drop in heart rate, diarrhea, nausea, and another symptom is you may no longer even register physical pain. That is actually something that I've experienced, and I'm wondering if you could put in the comments if you've had that experience before where you just completely shut down, went into freeze mode, and when you think back to that moment in your life, you realize you did not register physical pain at that point? I would be curious to know. Okay, so the next bullet point number 8, is going to be listing different physical symptoms of trauma, right? Because sometimes you went through something traumatizing and then the assumption is that, okay, well, that's something from the past and you're over it now. But actually a lot of things can happen in your body because your body is holding on to that trauma. It says here, chronic back and neck pain, fibromyalgia, migraines, digestive problems, spastic colon, irritable bowel syndrome, chronic fatigue, and some forms of asthma. Traumatized children have 50 times the rate of asthma as their non-traumatized peers. So this was, once again, life-changing for me because I went through life saying, oh, I have IBS and asthma, and I always felt like these were just medical problems. I had to see a specialist. I had to figure this out. There had to be some kind of cure, And then when I read the book, it was like a little bit of an epiphany where I realized, okay, this is not this is not really what I thought. This is a symptom of something else. And to me, that was really helpful. So I'm hoping this is helpful to you guys as well. So in terms of talking about being traumatized in childhood and then having lingering effects into adulthood, I'll read you the paragraph he has on that. Children who don't feel safe in infancy also show more physiological stress as expressed in heart rate variability, stress hormone responses, and lowered immune factors. Does this kind of biological dysregulation automatically reset to normal as a child matures or is moved to a safe environment? So far as we know, it does not. So I remember being in therapy many years ago. I felt this strange sense that there was something, some type of permanent damage inside of my brain that I needed to somehow identify. And I kind of felt like I hit a wall talking to the therapist and not really being able to get a clear answer as to why do I feel like there's something something wrong upstairs, like what's really going on inside of my brain was what I was asking. And at the time, I didn't really have an answer. And so when I read this book, I felt like I finally was on the right path. I finally found words to describe what was wrong, and it was like a great discovery because I felt like, okay, it's my dorsal vagal complex. That's what's wrong. It just, it's a good feeling when you finally find information that you have been looking for a really long time. Okay, so now we move on to bullet point number 9. So this is a concept called embodied memory. And again, let me know in the comments if you've experienced this. So there was a French physician in the 19th century by the name of Charcot. And it says here, he conducted some studies. For example, in 1889, he published the case of a patient named Lilog who developed paralysis of the legs after being involved in a traffic accident with a horse-drawn cart. Like many other patients at the Salpêtrière, Lilog expressed his experience physically. Instead of remembering the accident, he developed paralysis of his legs. So in this case, you just have to realize there was no spinal cord damage on this patient. What happened was it wasn't really the physical damage. It was the psychological stress from being traumatized by this accident that made him unable to use his legs. So in other words, he was paralyzed, but it was almost like a symptom of how traumatized he was from the accident. I think this is kind of the final frontier of what we understand because we know this can happen, but I don't think we've identified how to fix it yet. Bessel Van Der Kolk mentions there was a patient who had a similar symptom where exposure to certain things would make him have these sudden episodes where he couldn't move his legs, and then he just had to rest and it would go away. And that wasn't something they were able to fix, even with all the modalities that they used. So I think that's still something that's quite mysterious in the field of medicine. So bullet point number 10 on our list, which is our last point for today, is a quote from the book. It's a good segue to part 3, which will discuss all the different modalities to help treat trauma. So here's the quote. Finding words to describe what has happened to you can be transformative, but it does not always abolish flashbacks or improve concentration. So what he's saying here is sort of the limitations of talk therapy, right? So if you have a therapist, there's a lot of reasons why it can be helpful. The therapist can become a huge ally, an objective point of view on the situation. If you have people around you in your family or among your friends or in your relationships that are gaslighting you, the therapist can be that voice of reason who helps you realize, no, it's not just you, and the situation is not healthy, etc. And so it can be great to have somebody to talk to who's impartial and neutral in the situation. However, like he says in the quote, it doesn't abolish the flashback. So there's something that happens in the brain that's affected by trauma that needs some healing. And that is something a little bit separate from what you can get from talk therapy. So I will be working on part 3 of this video, which will list all the different modalities that have been shown to help with trauma. And I hope you'll join me for part 3. Till next time, happy reading!